Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, today we are going to dive back into our friends at Kings and Generals, who, congratulations, Kings and Generals, just went over 4 million subscribers. I'm proud to support them on Patreon, one of quite a few channels that I support. I love the content that they produce, and this one is called What Everyone Gets Wrong About Feudalism. I love talking about medieval history, so this will be a great topic to dive into. I'll put the link down in the description so you can check it out, and all of Kings and General's great content without my commentary. Now, speaking of Patreon, I want to give a big shout out to our newest executive producer level patron, Jeremiah from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Jeremiah, have we met? Next time in Gettysburg, let's definitely connect. Grab some lunch or just meet on the battlefield somewhere. But thank you so much for your support, Jeremiah. I could not do it without people like you. Let's dive into this one.
Most people, whether fans of history or not, will have come into contact with the concept of feudalism in one way or another, and will have heard terms such as feudalism, vassals, and lords used to describe the legal and social structures that made up the period known as the Middle Ages. This is understandable, as up until the 1990s, the majority of historical research assumed that the feudal pyramid was the overarching system that defined the economic, social, and military fabric of the medieval era. However, the feudal system and its origins have been much less clean-cut in light of more recent research.
Yeah, I mean, like anything else in history, it's nuanced. There's gray areas. How the feudal system looked in one place is not at all how it looked in other places. Some places it didn't exist at all. It constantly evolved and changed to fit the needs of whatever place it was. But I think one of the overarching understandings we need to have about this period is that the modern concept of a nation state is just not the way things were back then. Borders were based largely on lords and on relationships rather than on strict kind of lines drawn on a map.
Modern historians are far more divided as to when and how the feudal system came into being, and whether it is at all suitable for describing the complexity of the European Middle Ages with its many regionalisms, cultures, legal systems, and forms of organization.
Yeah.
With these introductory words, we welcome you to our video, in which we explore what everyone got wrong about the feudal system, and how our understanding of it has changed in the present day.
I think, as I said earlier, the main idea here is that there's no one-size-fits-all. There's no one way things were done. And how things were done in England is different than how they were done in France versus how they were done in what we know today as Germany or Italy or any of these other places. And how they were done in England in 1050 is not at all how they were done in England in 1350. And so there's, when we're talking about things like this, we have to talk about one specific snapshot of a moment, because you blink and it changes.
Every week we release 3 new exclusive videos for our members and patrons. The Pacific War, the Eastern Front of World War II Prelude, and many other series, including the War of Spanish Succession, Punic Wars, Iberian Reconquista, Russian Revolution and Civil War, North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, and much more. It has been long overdue, but we have finally created a YouTube channel exclusively for our Kings and Generals podcasts. Please go and check out Kings and Generals podcast, home to the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast. Link in the description and pinned comment. To see those, as well as get access to our exclusive Discord, see our schedule, and get early access to all videos, join the ranks of our patrons and YouTube members via the links in the description and pinned comment. Thanks to our supporters for allowing us to continue doing our dream job.
Before we get to the deconstruction of the feudal system, we should first take a look at the outlines of older research. The classical model by which historians understood the emergence of medieval feudalism developed at the turn of the 20th century, and still filled university handbooks as late as the 1980s. This model assumed that the feudal system developed in the 8th century, under the Carolingian dynasty, which practiced components of vassalage and fiefdoms inherited from the late Roman Empire.
So, as I often say on this channel, where do you start with anything in history? You know, for example, let's just take one event, World War I. If we're going to talk about the history of World War I, do we go back to 1914 to the events of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, or do we say, you know what, that all happened because of the events of the Balkan Wars, which, then do we go back to the Franco-Prussian War, which is a huge component of why things happened the way they did? And the Franco-Prussian War only happened because of the events of the 1860s, with wars between Germany and Austria, and the Schleswig-Holstein Wars, and you have the Congress of Vienna, and you have the Napoleonic Wars, and you have the French Revolution, and the American Revolution, and the English Civil War, and it's all connected. So likewise with the events of feudalism developing in Europe, where do you start? Because no matter where you start, there's going to be something that was a precursor to that. So I wouldn't say that the history books they're describing were wrong. It was just that they chose a particular starting point, and now we're saying, you know what, maybe we should go back a little further in order to really understand how it got to that point.
The idea of commendation, as well as the customs of the early Germanic people. The term commendation derives from the Latin si commendare, to entrust oneself to someone. In the final centuries of the Western Roman Empire, it was a practice where a free man placed himself under the protection of a more powerful man in order to receive a form of maintenance and protection.
The Romans had this system of patronage, right, where you can definitely see elements in the way society worked and the military worked and governance worked in the Roman Empire that are later used in the feudal system. And you can see elements of our modern systems in the way things were done in the feudal system. It's all connected.
Turn, the subordinate was now obliged to serve and obey his new lord. This form of subordination was not exactly attractive, as one was a subject to a master out of unfavorable reasons. Nevertheless, this was a common practice in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. The other, more attractive personal component of vassalage was thought to have emerged from the oaths of allegiance sworn by warriors and lesser chiefs towards greater chiefs among the ancient Germanic peoples. However,
so much like what happened, say, in England later on, where you have the elements of Anglo-Saxons, the elements of what they called the Danes, the Viking culture, the elements of Norman culture coming in, it all kind of mixes together. Same thing here. You've got the Romans, you've got the Germanic tribes, you've got the Celts, you've got all of this hodgepodge of things, and somewhere out of all of that is born the medieval period of Europe.
This practice was likely not Germanic in origin, but was probably an adoption of Roman military oaths, which were first adopted by the Germanic peoples when they entered into the service of the empire after migrating into Roman territory, and in continued use by the powerful even after the end of the Roman Empire in the West. Both of these forms of allegiance formed the personal basis for medieval vassalage as it was understood by 20th century historians. Older research assumed that fiefs, the material component of feudalism, could be found in abundance in the sources of the 8th and 9th centuries under the term beneficium. Mostly, these beneficia were legal transactions in the widely used legal practice of the precarium loan. In this practice, a person is asked for the temporary use of another person's property, usually land, without the borrower receiving ownership rights. The reasons for entering into such an agreement were manifold, and mostly favorable for both parties. However, what was most important about this precarium loan was its flexibility in usage, and the fact that it created social ties by dividing ownership and use between two parties for a
And that's the great point he makes there, is that all of this is related to social connection. As I said earlier, it's not about lines on a map, though there certainly were those boundaries existing, but they constantly change. It was about your personal connection to a lord, that lord's personal connection to whoever their lord was, and so on and so forth.
Certain period of time. Older scholarship translated most of these precarium loans on the basis that these were particularly favorable to the person requesting them, simply as fiefs, and concluded that they were issued by lords to vassals in return for military service. Thus, in a short time, the elements of personal loyalty, in the form of commendation and warrior oaths, merged with the granting of land in the form of precarium loans, and formed the feudal system, whereby the warlike period of the 8th century in particular was thought to be a catalyst, leading to the development of the feudal system. The driving force for the spread of this new practice was thought to be the need for more cavalry soldiers. It was suggested that besides the internal struggle for supremacy over the realm of the Franks, the confrontation with forces from the border regions of Europe led to a change in the composition of the Frankish army. In contact with the agile cavalry warriors of the Arabian sphere and the Avars, as well as the need for a rapid reaction force against the raids of the Norsemen, Frankish armored horsemen had replaced peasant foot soldiers.
I will say this, I mean, in any circumstance in history, the needs that develop based on what's happening do have an impact on where you go from there. You know, we talk about this anytime there's wartime, talk about how inventions take place that are initially put into place because of a need for war, but then eventually they can be developed into some civilian use as well. And so, yeah, I mean, the Carolingians, for example, and their contact with the Muslim threat coming up from the Iberian Peninsula definitely has an impact in how places like France are governed, Francia, I guess as it was at the time, are governed, and how their military develops, and how they respond to threats, and how they manage their own territory, especially as they take new lands or defend those lands against outside threats.
As the more expensive and time-consuming equestrian service required greater material resources than that of a foot soldier, the horsemen needed to be financially equipped. This is where the practice of granting fiefdoms in the form of precarium loans was believed to have intensified. It was stated that Charles Martel had requisitioned property from the large lands that church institutions held and issued it as fiefs to his men in order to obtain more cavalry warriors that were bound to him as vassi with the above-mentioned practices. However, Pippin the Younger and Carloman, the sons of Charles Martel, wanted to return the requisitioned property to the church in the middle of the 8th century. Naturally,
Carloman wearing the crown of the Holy Roman Empire there, which you can see in Vienna, amazing museum.
Both kings did not want to go without the military potential of their vassi, and could not simply dispossess them of the granted lands. So they resorted to a trick. The church received their land back, but had to hand it over directly to the vassi as precarium loans, who could thus continue to perform their military service for the king. This model quickly spread throughout the Frankish Empire, and ecclesiastical and secular magnates adopted it. From their own property, or from land that they themselves had received as a fiefdom from the king, they gave land to their subordinates as a sub-fief. Furthermore, it was also thought that many officers, such as bishoprics, dukes, and counts, were bound to the king in this way as vassals. Thus, early medieval society under the Carolingians was believed to have become a feudal society, shaped by a straightforward system that was based on land grants for personal loyalty between lords and vassals.
I'm sure he's going to say the actuality of it is it's much more complicated than that, as we've been talking about.
As control over land was the central resource in the early Middle Ages, it was thought that besides military organization, politics and the economy developed alongside the lines of the feudal system. Over time, the hereditary nature of the fiefs developed, so that the king's access to the landed property of the nobility, and thus the royal power, dwindled. The feudal system mutated. The monograph Fiefs and Vassals, the Medieval Evidence Reinterpreted, by British historian Susan Reynolds, released in 1994, presented a particular turning point for this model of the social structure of the early Middle Ages, and thus the subsequent development of the medieval epoch.
Now, I will say this, and I'm not discrediting the book that he's about to quote from. I am one who, I guess I'm more of a traditionalist. I get wary of people coming along, and this happens a lot, especially recently, people coming along and saying, you know what, everything that every historian for the past several hundred years has told you is completely wrong. Buy my book where I explain why they're all wrong and I'm right. I'm not saying that's what happened here. But what I'm saying is that when something new comes along, let's not just say, oh, wow, everybody else was wrong. This person's right. Let's be much more critical than that about these things and take everything as a whole. There may be some really good points made here, but that doesn't mean we throw out everything that's been written for the last several hundred years.
Reynolds' critique mostly pointed out that research up to this point had often interpreted and translated terms found in the early medieval sources in a too narrow view. She rightly noted that words such as vassal or fief are not as commonplace in the sources as they are made out to be. Moreover, when they do appear, they do not automatically have to be read in the model of the feudal system, especially not in the context of a lord-vassal relationship that is mostly based on military service. Yet, older research did exactly that, and was thus very intentional and one-sided with the translation of source terms. As already mentioned, terms such as vassi and beneficia can be found in the charters originating in the Frankish world from the 6th century onwards. However, Susan Reynolds showed that these terms were rarely as unambiguous in the early Middle Ages as older research depicted them. Only on rare occasions were the charters of the time precise in the terminology and usage. Thus, the interpretation as a lord and vassal relationship who exchanged loyalty and lands for military service, advice, and protection is only in very few cases the most likely.
I'm just playing devil's advocate here. I'm not saying she's wrong. She's got a point that just because it's said doesn't mean we should assume one thing. But I would also push back and say that just because it's not explicitly stated that it's that way doesn't mean that isn't how it was. So the interpretations that he's saying may be outdated and wrong may be wrong. But it may just be that they're right in their assumptions, even though it wasn't specifically spelled out. I hope that makes sense.
Similarly, a large number of other words such as fidelis, confidante, hominis, and militias were liberally interpreted as vassals and thought of directly in the context of feudalism, without taking into account the ambiguity of these terms or the precise background they might have in a charter.
So I took about the last 45 minutes from the moment I just stopped until now to do a little digging into this, because I realized I was pushing back against this view of feudalism through the lens of one particular book pretty hard, and I wanted to make sure that I knew what I was talking about a little more. And first of all, what I want to say is that what I'm cautioning against is a larger issue, in which I see this happening a lot lately, where somebody comes out with a book and everyone decides, well, not everyone, a lot of people completely change their view of a historic topic based on that one book. And I would encourage people to never do that, no matter what the book is. If we see it through one book, we're seeing it through that author's biases, worldview, whatever blind spots they have in their own research. But rather we should take it as a whole. And I'm not denying the book that they're referring to here and the author's impact on the study of feudalism. It's absolutely huge from everything I'm reading. And she makes some excellent points. But the main criticism that I'm seeing of her work is that she is coming down so hard on this idea that things like feudalism don't mean only one thing, that she's basically caused a kind of a reflexive reaction in the opposite direction that means we can never interpret feudalism that way. And that's a danger. Just because it didn't always mean that doesn't mean that it doesn't sometimes mean that. And that's where it gets difficult, because when does it and when doesn't it? So, and the other criticism I'm seeing a lot is that by her being so hypercritical of the definitions of words like feudalism and vassal, basically, if we take that to its inevitable conclusion, we can never trust the definition of any historic term throughout history, which means our understanding of history goes right out the door on most things. So I guess all I'm saying is that Susan Reynolds, great work, highly regarded, has definitely had a huge impact on our understanding of feudalism and vassals, but should be taken as part of a larger view and not the only view through which we view these things. So let's just, kind of, it's the same thing we do in theology, right? If you take one single Bible verse out of context, you can make it say just about anything you want to. It's called proof texting. You start with an idea, and then you look for proof to back it up. Whereas rather we should see each Bible verse in the context of the entirety of Scripture. We should see Susan Reynolds' work as a great lens through which to view these things, but not the only lens through which to view these things. Okay.
In many cases, however, the sources distinguish quite clearly between these different terms, and do not depict them in any form of a lord and vassal relationship. The term beneficium is also far more ambiguous in its use in the sources. It encompasses a range of phenomena and practices corresponding to its basic meaning of a benefice, and could refer to a broad range of land loans or benefiting events.
In other words, don't just view it one way, right? I mean, it's complicated, it's layered, it's nuanced. That's history.
Historical research from the 1930s and 40s were not unaware of this, but undertook the step of excluding all beneficia from the peasant rural area of life from their consideration, as these so-called peasant fiefs could not be compared with knightly or vassal fiefdoms. Unsurprisingly, this artificial scientific separation led to a narrowing of the terms, which otherwise would have had a variety of meanings and uses in the early medieval sources. Furthermore, regional developments and local particularities were not really taken into further consideration while interpreting the sources. Thus, the terminology in the sources must be taken seriously in the context of the individual source, because what a vassus provided and what the beneficium was that was received is often not as clearly stated as the concept of feudalism makes it out to be.
It's fair.
In addition, some of the basic developments that are assumed by older research about the origins of the feudal system are not as strongly proven as they seem, and have since
Doesn't mean, again, that it didn't happen that way. It just means we can't really say for sure it happened that way.
been reconsidered in the wake of Reynolds' studies. To begin with, the assertion of older research that Charles Martel confiscated church property and issued it in exchange for military service is not proven. In fact, there is hardly any evidence for the confiscation of church property on a broad basis from the sources of Charles Martel's time. The fact that Pippin the Younger and his brother Carloman restituted church property under their reign is also not based on a large number of surviving precarium loan contracts.
Yeah, but, and this is true again in history, you'd be surprised how many events in history we have very few sources for, right? How many things we base our entire understanding of an event or a time period on one or two sources. And so if you start to question those one or two sources, what are you left with? Not a whole lot.
But only on the result of a single synod held in 743 or 744 in Estins. Although this synod mentions the connection between military service and precarium loans, it speaks of an impending war for which church property was to equip warriors for a limited period of time. There is no hint that this was a common practice, or that it had the restitution of an already alienated property at its core. Furthermore, the idea that officials such as bishops, counts, and dukes were bound to the king as vassals is one formed on a foundation of sand. During the whole Carolingian period, sources differentiated between vassals of the king and holders of office, the latter often singled out by the officer's terminology. The vassals are strictly separated in enumerations in the sources, and find themselves behind the magnates and holders of office. Newer research suggests that the binding between an office and a corresponding fief only emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries, with the
It evolved, it developed. I mean, that's how this stuff worked.
emergence of stronger institutionalization in the proto-state.
So I guess if I'm interpreting what they're saying here, and it makes sense, is that stuff that developed in the 12th and 13th centuries, our understanding then should not be that the stuff that's developing then was already existing in the 8th and 9th centuries. That makes total sense to me.
Thus, bishops, counts, and dukes were not bound to the king as vassals by a hierarchical structure of fiefs, but by other means of loyalty, trust, and consensus within the elite. To make matters worse,
We're not bound that way at that time. Those things developed later.
the German historian Roman Deutinger pointed out that he could not make out one single sub-vassal in the sources of the Frankish Empire from the 8th and 9th centuries. As we have demonstrated, the historical reality contained in the early medieval sources was much more diverse than the historical reality reconstructed by older research.
Okay, so what we're really just saying is that what feudalism looked like in the 1300s is not what it looked like in the 900s. Makes sense.
So much more diverse, in fact, that the concept of feudalism is unable to capture it. To use the words of Roman Deutinger, a system that allows a myriad of exceptions and can only be proven in a few individual cases is no longer a system, but simply a fiction.
Wouldn't go that far.
Today, the image of Carolingian rule is, therefore, less one of a centralized empire with the system of feudalism as its dominating structure at its core, and more one of diverse personal ties and practices, which were used skillfully and flexibly by contemporaries, opening up relationships that went far beyond the duality of lord and vassal.
That's fair.
Therefore, the birthplace and time of feudalism as a system in Europe lies elsewhere.
I don't know that it does, though. I still think that you can argue this as a potential for the birthplace of it. It just wasn't fully grown, right? You know, if I'm talking about who I was at 3 months old, it doesn't mean that I'm vlogging through history at 3 months old, but I'm still born in 1977. My birthplace is my birthplace. That's where I started to develop. And everything that happened through my childhood, through my teenage years, into my 20s and 30s, and now into my 40s, it's all a part of that process of bringing me to where I am now. So just because feudalism in the 800s is in its infancy compared to what it becomes in the 1300s, it doesn't mean it's not born there.
According to Susan Reynolds and others, the origins of feudalism lie in northern Italy in the late 11th and early 12th centuries.
The origins of the more modern view of feudalism. I know I'm being contrary here. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just trying to give you a view, like a wide range of viewpoints on this.
During those centuries, the emerging jurists of that region studied the Roman law codes that had remained in partial legal use in Italy long after the fall of the Roman Empire. Inspired by the clear structure of the Roman law codes, these early lawyers tried to structure, categorize, and regulate the diverse practices regarding noble inheritance, loyalty, fiefs, land loans, military duty, breaches of duty, and the difference between a noble and a commoner's fief.
So what we're talking about here is the codification of what becomes feudalism. It's kind of like when we talk about the invention of sports, right? Where do you say that a sport like what we Americans call soccer, what most of the rest of the world calls football, association football, when would you say that began? Well, when you start studying the history, a lot of people will point to, okay, the development of the Football Association in England. Okay, but that's based on a game that was already in existence for hundreds, if not thousands of years. It's just that at that point they codified it and they gave it laws, they gave it regulations, they made it more uniform based on those things. And I see the same kind of thing happening here in this argument.
Moreover, they tried to stratify who was even able to be granted a fiefdom, and on what basis. Within these treatises, the legal scholars attempted to make a strong connection between fiefs and vassalage. In doing so, the jurists attempted to break down the diverse legal practices of their own environment, which often gave rise to conflicts, in order to create basic and clear-cut normative principles that would result in regional stability and easier work for them. Within this, the strict categories and terms of vassals and lords and their relationship along the idea of vassalage emerged. Through the increased spread of these texts and the intensified dissemination of written and codified law in Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries, the work of these Italian jurists was more and more used to define what a fief was, thereby separating the concept of a fief from other forms of land loans and practices. Reynolds argues that in the later 16th century, lawyers specializing in feudal law took up these texts in order to explain the medieval world and its ruling mechanisms according to these legal texts. Historians of the 19th century then took on this early modern picture as their own canvas, to paint models and systems of the Middle Ages on it. When this critique is taken seriously, one concludes that the common idea of a universal feudal system was just that, the idea of jurists who tried to categorize and differentiate the diverse practices of human ways of life.
I don't disagree with that. I think we can agree on the fact that this is when it was kind of made more universal, more uniform, more evenly understood from one place to another.
And their connections into only a few strict cases and categories. Where does this leave historiography with regard to the feudal system? Today, most historians follow Reynolds' critique and thought, with some added nuances of their own. In recent years, historians have suggested using a more source-oriented terminology for the early Middle Ages, in order to move away from the artificial terms and unfitting translations previously used in the research discourse when it comes to fiefs and vassals in the early and high Middle Ages. Furthermore, regional studies on feudalism and its corresponding origins and particularities became a staple in research. In doing so, historians try to grasp the facts and concepts of fiefdoms, vassals, loans, personal relations, and so forth that are definitely present in the sources as close to the sources as possible.
Yeah.
After all, the lending of land, offices, sovereignty, and property rights remains a defining phenomenon in medieval European history. More videos about history's most common misconceptions are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it.
All right, that was good. I think that gave me a lot to think about personally, and I think it gave us some good kind of overarching themes to discuss within the context of talking about feudalism and how it worked and how it didn't. And I hope that it has maybe challenged some of your viewpoints as well. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Definitely check out Kings and Generals. They're one of my favorite channels on this platform, and I cannot recommend them enough to you. I want to thank Ryan in State College, Pennsylvania, and Hillary in Pittsburgh for your support on Patreon. Couldn't do it without you. Thank you so much. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.